Getting into the numbers of it all, immigrants are overrepresented when it comes to crime in general, including rape. This type of research is so taboo in Sweden that they don't do it at all anymore, with the excuse being that ethnicity isn't relevant. This despite the fact that some ethnicities are more prevalent than others. The last times Sweden's Crime Prevention Council looked into the matter was in 2005 and 1996. The study from 1996 is based on data from 1985 to 1989. When it comes to rape, immigrants are 4 times more likely to be registered for the offense. The children of immigrants are 1.5 times more likely. Ethnic groups that stand out in the crime statistics are namely immigrants from countries like Algeria, Libya, Morocco, Tunisia, Iraq, and Chile. Every 4th to 5th immigrant from these countries was registered for crime during a 5-year period. To give some perspective to that number, every 17th Swede was registered for crime, and every 15th Vietnamese. There's a notable difference between immigrants from countries in the MENA region and immigrants from countries like Japan, China, and America, where the overrepresentation is barely worth mentioning. The ones responsible for the study also say that this can't be explained with differences in socio-economical status in Sweden. In other words, they checked for poverty, segregation, residential area, and gender, and it still doesn't explain the differences. The overrepresentation remained, with only a slight decrease. They do point out it's possible that the overrepresentation could depend on socio-economical status in the immigrant's birth country, meaning that it could be more likely for criminals to relocate to a different country. But they weren't able to analyze that in this particular study. However, it sure would explain why immigrants from Denmark, Norway, and Finland also had a higher general crime participation than Swedes, but their numbers weren't nearly as high as the ethnic groups mentioned earlier. In any case, immigrant overrepresentation in crime can't be explained with oversimplified leftist rhetoric about social injustice. It can't be bottled down to Swedish society just being a big ol' racist discriminating against immigrants. If that's your explanation, then why do people from Arab countries have higher criminal tendencies than people from India, Spain, or Asian countries? Denmark found similar numbers concerning overrepresentation. From the time period of 2004 to 2013, immigrants made out 34.5% of all rape cases, more than 3 times their size of the population, and the most popular countries of origin were Iraq, Turkey, Somalia, and Lebanon. Norway found similar numbers as well, measuring the time period from 2001 to 2004. 6% of Norwegians committed some crime during this time period. Compare that to 17.8% of immigrants from Africa. Countries with the highest percentage of perpetrators were Morocco, Iran, Somalia, and Iraq. We need to stop viewing the term immigrants as if it were one giant homogeneous group. The truth is that immigrants from certain countries don't have a noteworthy overrepresentation, while immigrants from other countries do. So perhaps the explanation can be found in cultural heritage, and perhaps what researchers should be doing is going in depth on the socio-cultural backgrounds and differences between various immigrant groups, so they can find more sustainable explanations to the obvious differences between various immigrant groups and crime. Now, when it comes to criminality as a whole, overrepresentation amongst immigrants is 2.1, which means that more than twice as many immigrants than Swedes were registered as having committed crimes during the 85 to 89 year period. But although there is an overrepresentation, 85% of all immigrants were not registered for any crimes whatsoever. And although the report showed a strong overrepresentation for heavier crimes like burglary, rape, and murder, they still concluded that the values were too small for any sustainable conclusions to be made as a whole. You could make assumptions, but sustainable conclusions would require more data. So imagine the irony when the follow-up report released 10 years later in 2005 had this to say. In our last report, there were detailed analyses made in regards to perpetrator country of origin. This time we have decided that such a detailed analysis serves no purpose. Put simply, political correctness scared them shitless. This is basically confirmed by a former politician for the People Party by the name of Mauricio Rojas. He was their spokesperson for integration issues. He said that when he met two of the men who were responsible for the new report being made, the meeting testified to a noticeable nervousness that the publication caused in certain environments. One of the men was Jan Alberg, the author of the first report from 1996, and during the conversation, Alberg stated that the new report essentially confirmed the results from the previous report. The study from 2005 is based on reported crime in the years 1997 to 2001. The results are basically the same, with a slight increase. Individuals with a foreign background are more likely to be suspected of crimes. There was another study released in the year 2000 which covers gang rapes during the 90s. They defined gang rapes as 2 or more perpetrators and found that little more than half of all gang rapes at that time were done by men with a foreign background. And the number of reported gang rapes increased with more than 400% from 1995 to 2006. According to the Crime Prevention Council's investigator, this can only partially be explained with slight changes in crime classification. There could have been an actual increase as well. However, she's skeptical towards it being due to immigration. She says that Swedish men behave badly too, and suspects that the increased number of gang rapes is due to increased alcohol consumption. This despite the fact that all the major gang rapes in the media the past years have had non-white immigrants as perpetrators, and of course the mass media typically never revealed their ethnicity, so it's only thanks to the alternative media that I know this. Now, this is an article from 2007. It says that due to insufficient funding, many sentenced rapists aren't getting any treatment in jail. The problem being that they aren't good with the Swedish language, and there isn't enough money to hire interpreters. At Salberga, the country's biggest prison for rapists, only 24 out of 49 could participate in therapy. Basically, half the rapists don't know Swedish. Another article from 2012 let citizens ask questions about rape to a doctor in litigation. Someone asked about immigrant overrepresentation, to which she replied, "I don't see an overrepresentation. If you look at all the verdicts in Sweden from 2010, 147 perpetrators were Swedes, and 166 perpetrators were of foreign background." Now, this really summarizes the politically correct psychosis. She claims that this isn't an overrepresentation, despite the fact that it's the very definition of an overrepresentation. The amount of Swedish citizens with a foreign background in 2010 was 19.1%, and that's counting both men and women. So let's say maybe 10% of the population were men with a foreign background. What does it say when 10% of the population are accountable for half the rapes in the entire country? Apart from the notion that you shouldn't underestimate a minority, it says that there's something terribly weird going on that should be investigated further, not covered up. Now, I'm not saying that any of this is absolute truth. These are just my speculations based on the numbers I've come across. It's totally possible there's perspectives we haven't even thought of yet to explain these numbers, which is why I would like to see more research on this topic, instead of censorship and the stereotypical Swedish fear of offending people. If I'm wrong in my speculations, I'd like to know. I've been accused of racism for my video Welcome to Sweden because of my remarks about Sweden being a rape capital and third world immigration. Let me elaborate on what I meant when I said that. I'm fully aware that you can't compare rape statistics internationally, and I don't believe for a second that Sweden is some kind of rape capital that's worse off than Saudi Arabia when it comes to rape, a country where the victims are punished as badly as the perpetrators. No wonder women don't report as much. You can't compare rape statistics because the legal definition of rape varies amongst countries. For example, in Egypt it's not illegal to rape your wife, and rape using objects is only classified as assault. So when you look at crime statistics, it's going to appear as if Egypt is more progressive than Sweden, but that's because they don't treat rape as rape. Also, the methods for counting crime varies across countries, as well as the citizens' confidence in the criminal justice system. So I have no idea if Sweden is a rape capital. It's something I said in rebellious jest, and that wasn't even my point. My point was that the Swedish debate climate is so incredibly sensitive and so censored that you aren't even allowed to ask the question, can our high rape statistics partially be explained by immigration? Well, I'm fully aware that the large number of rapes per capita can be explained by our progressive rape legislations. And I think our so-called wide definition of rape isn't wide whatsoever, it's fully reasonable, and more countries should take after us in that regard. However, I also believe that our numbers can partially be explained by immigration. This doesn't mean I believe all individuals from Africa and the Middle East to be rapists. I never made a statement about an entire group of people. I made a statement about geographical locations, referring to their culture. You see, what culture does is to create tendencies, not absolutes. So it's obvious to me that the number of rapists is going to be higher in certain cultures. Acknowledging that Swedes have more alcohol-related crime than Arabs doesn't mean that you're accusing all Swedes of being drunken criminals. Cultures don't decide what every single individual in a particular region is going to be like. Cultures create tendencies and increase probabilities. As I said previously, the absolute majority of immigrants don't commit crimes whatsoever. The follow-up report in 2005 showed even higher numbers in that regard, going from 85% to a minimum of 88%. So at least 88% of all immigrants in Sweden don't commit crimes. I'm fully aware that most immigrants are well-behaved, reasonable people. That, however, does not change the overrepresentation within certain ethnic groups. And I suspect that the minority of rapists in misogynistic cultures is going to be larger than the minority of rapists in more progressive cultures. Cultures create blueprint for behavior. So I'm not surprised that the New Year's Eve sex attacks in Köln were primarily by men from the MENA region. I do not think this is a coincidence. Those countries have the worst view on women's rights and female sexuality in the world, and that's an objective fact, because this is reflected both in their gender norms and legislations. Cultures matter, and it would be downright foolish to assume that this doesn't affect a large portion of men growing up in that culture. Cultures are very important. This is not racism. A culture is a collection of ideas. It is norms, laws, traditions. You can't be racist towards ideas, and there's nothing racist about criticizing cultures. All cultures are not equal, because all ideas are not equally good. It's not a matter of skin color, that's just what culture does. If you, as a white person, had been born there instead, then your view on what's normal would be different too. That is how cultures work. They create normality. And the feminists who claim that men are the same everywhere are basically implying that this behavior is biological. Because if it's not a matter of social and cultural attitudes, then there isn't anything you can do about it. There's no perspective to change. Men are just inherently pigs because of their genes, and especially men from the Middle East. If you ask me, that perspective is way more racist than just suggesting that people are shaped by their surroundings. So, here's the most important question that people should be discussing, and this is a discussion that's long overdue. What can be done about all of this? Well, I have a number of suggestions, and you're welcome to contribute with your own in the comment section. First of all, the biggest danger for everyone is silence. We need to learn from Norway and Finland. These are countries that offer newly arrived migrants lessons in how to treat women. And if you read New York Times article about it, you'll understand that they're doing it in a very considerate way. Those kind of classes don't have to be condescending, and they are very necessary. In the article, a Muslim asylum seeker from Eritrea explains how shocked he was to see women in skimpy clothes drinking alcohol and kissing in public, because in his country, only prostitutes do that. He found the cultural differences to be very confusing and actually volunteered to participate in this program. He said he still has a hard time accepting that a wife could accuse her husband of rape, but that he learned how to read previously baffling signals from women who wear short skirts, smile, or simply walk alone at night without an escort. He said that in his home country, if someone wants a woman, he can just take her and he won't be punished by the police. He realizes that Norway treats women very differently, and I think him volunteering to participate in this program really says all that there is to say. He's clearly interested in adapting to his new country. He just needs active help from society to do that, and this is crucial. Here's another article interviewing an asylum seeker from Iraq. He talks about what it was like moving to Finland and the migrant sex attacks in Köln. He's not at all surprised by what happened in Germany on New Year's Eve, but at the same time he feels that you can't really generalize when it comes to refugees. At the refugee house he's staying at, they had a class for the migrants on how to treat women. He started laughing because the situation was so absurd to him. It seemed weird that the Finnish people felt they had to explain such obvious things to them. But then he realized that the other refugees didn't react the same way as him. In fact, a lot of them were surprised and said that what they learned about behavior conduct and social norms in Finland was completely new to them. So ultimately, he felt it was a good thing that they held these behavior classes. He says that interaction between men and women in Iraq is completely different. Women aren't allowed to talk to anyone in public places, so generally men don't casually approach them. If they do, it can lead to trouble for the woman between her and her family. He gives a concrete example of how social interaction works, saying, "If I'm dating a girl, I'm not allowed to spend time with her alone in the beginning. The girl's family is usually present on the first date, and the man gets to sit far from the woman and talk to her using a phone, while she sits further away with her family. On a first date, I'm not even allowed to come near her." He also says that the biggest surprise to him culturally with Finland was that when a woman looks at you, it doesn't mean anything. In Iraq, if a man wants to talk to a woman, he will usually follow her from a distance, and if she makes eye contact with him, it means that she's interested in him. Merely looking at him is a confirmation of interest, so he believes a lot of men think it works the same way in Finland, and figure that if a woman looks at them, it means something, so they start following women in the street. His closing statement, which I completely agree with, is that in order to decrease tensions and ethnic gaps and smooth out cultural differences, there needs to be more classes, more events, more gatherings where refugees and natives meet and talk about each other's cultures. There has to be a direct dialogue. If migrants sit segregated at asylum houses and merely talk about Scandinavians without actually meeting them, and Scandinavians just sit at home and talk about migrants, nothing's gonna get better. So I think we should have a class in social orientation for all refugees, where they get to learn about social norms and the Swedish outlook on everything. Things like religion's place in society, LGBT rights, women's rights, how to raise your children in Sweden, barbaric customs like striking your children and female genital mutilation must be challenged. And I really don't see why this is such a radical suggestion in Sweden. In America, you need to do a pretty thorough citizens test before you're allowed to become a citizen. Sweden should just improve on that concept. In Kenya, they've started having consent training for boys and self-empowerment classes for girls. The result is rape decreasing by 20%, and the amount of boys believing that miniskirts is an invitation dropped from 80% to 30%. Obviously, information makes a difference. We should have a similar class designed for migrants. And while we're at it, it sure wouldn't hurt to include something similar in our general sex education for Swedish schools as well, considering that even though immigrants are overrepresented, half of all rapes are still committed by native Swedes. Another thing we need is an immigration policy that's reasonable and fair. Anybody who isn't a Swedish citizen and commits a crime needs to be deported. That means anybody applying for asylum or anyone who's been given a residence permit. Angela Merkel suggested something along these lines, but she's absolutely full of shit. In Germany as well as Sweden, they don't deport someone if they're at risk for torture, persecution, or death in their home country. This is because of the European Convention on Human Rights. Merkel hasn't said that she wants to change that part of the convention, so even if her so-called tougher immigration laws were to be implemented, nobody would get deported. because a lot of these migrants committing crimes are precisely from those kind of countries. So you see, her remarks are just a pathetic populist attempt to retain her voters. I say we need to remove that moronic part of the convention because it directly violates the human rights of Swedish citizens. We shouldn't be forced to import rapists and murderers who don't respect our country. If you don't want to be deported to a shitty war zone, then don't rape people, asshole. Actions must have consequences. There's nothing anti-racist about importing rapists. It not only hurts the native Swedish population, but it also completely fucks up the reputation for every immigrant in Sweden who's a decent person fighting to do right by himself. We're the ones who have to directly experience the general public's frustration about the ridiculous immigration policy. We're the ones who pay the price for the politicians being irresponsible cowards. And then I get these retarded left-wing hippies and liberals saying, "You can't deport people, man. Everyone is worth the same." No, they're fucking not. Immigrants who behave are worth so much more than immigrants who rob and rape. Do not mix us together, because that's trivializing our good sense of morals and decent behavior. What you're essentially saying is that there's no difference between immigrants who are good and immigrants who are bad. And when you lump us all together like that and talk about tolerance and equal worth, you're essentially legitimizing the racist point of view that all immigrants are shit. Because if we're not defined by our actions, then even those of us who behave kindly are equal to robbers, rapists, and murderers. I want to live in a country where your behavior actually matters. I want to live in a country where you don't get away with rape. I'm a Swedish citizen now, and I'm not okay with the idea that every woman I know is less safe because ass-kissing left-wingers think I want to hear retarded cliches about equal human worth. I want to live in a country that values its own citizens higher than the citizens of other countries, because otherwise, what's the point in being a citizen? What's the point of contributing to Swedish society in any way when society isn't looking out for your best interest as a citizen? Last, but certainly not least, people envision integration as a process where immigrants who come to Europe become more European, that they start talking our languages and embracing our cultures. That is not the definition of integration policy, and that is not how it was phrased in the political document where Sweden argued for its implementation. In this document, integration is described as a mutual process. When immigrants come to a country, the country has to adapt to them as well. In other words, Swedes need to be integrated as well. Both the immigrant and the native must adapt to each other. This is not a good thing, because this means that the native population have to give up their culture to appease someone else's culture. And Swedes don't have anything they should compromise on. Their secular view on religion is fine. Their view on equality and sexuality is fine too. We need to abandon the idea of integration and instead promote assimilation. Or in other words, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Those who come to Sweden should adapt to Sweden. People have a very naive outlook on multiculturalism. They think it's just about these shallow, harmless, exciting cultural expressions, such as food, music, dancing, fashion, etc. And who would be opposed to that, you know? What they don't realize is that there's more to culture than that. It's also about how you view human life, the role of women in society, the validity of legal systems, how big influence religious ideas should have. All of that doesn't vanish just because you move to a different country. Why would the ideas you've been impregnated with for your entire life just disappear overnight? Everything you've been taught is right and wrong. Why would that disappear the minute you cross a border? When it comes to immigration, I cannot stress enough the importance of uniting people around values that are constructed through reason. Rational ideas are the sole things people from different origins can agree on. That's what can unite a Swede, a Bosnian, a Turk, an American, and an Arab. I do not see immigration as a problem. I see irresponsible immigration policy as a problem.